Hello. So right now I'd like to talk about auxiliaries. So auxiliaries are helpers, right? So like on your TV, for example, you might have a place that says aux, and that's because it's for helping. It's something extra. So sometimes these are called helping verbs. Basically, they don't do the main action. So for instance, when we say, I eat pizza, there are no auxiliaries here. But when we make this negative and say, I don't eat pizza, do is acting as an auxiliary here because the verb here is to eat and not to do. Okay, and as you have likely noticed already, auxiliaries are very common in English and very important in the language. In fact, most questions and negative statements in English require auxiliaries, and several verb tenses require them too. So let's look quickly at a few auxiliaries. To be can be a linking verb when it's the primary verb, as in she is beautiful. In this case, it is what's called a linking verb. It's an auxiliary or helper when it's helping to form a passive voice or a progressive form. She is singing from the verb to sing. And this book was written 5 years ago. It's helping the verb to write. Okay, we talked about do up here, right? Used in the negative, I do not, or as we normally pronounce it, don't eat pizza. Also the question form, do you eat pizza? The verb is still to eat. All right, have has a similar pattern. So have can be the real verb to have, as in you have beautiful eyes, or it can be the auxiliary used in the perfect tenses, as in I haven't seen that movie. Okay, there's also a special group of auxiliaries in English called modal auxiliaries. So for example, all of these are pretty important, but the one that you might be the most familiar with immediately is how we form our future tenses. I will eat pizza, the verb to eat. All right, so far you might be thinking auxiliaries, that sounds pretty basic, pretty easy. But something that we want to remember or learn if we don't know it yet about auxiliaries is how important they are for pronunciation in English, for understanding the way our language sounds. So one of the things that I know really drives people crazy when they're learning English as a second or third language is our contraction system. Right? And remember, those are the short forms like I'll go for I will go, or I'd have been there for I would have been there. Okay, so really, this is contracted in writing, in casual writing, to make it easier to write, but in conversation, this normally does sound like I'll go, even when we write the word completely out, I plus the full word will. All right, the contractions are not random. They actually have logic to them, and that logic is that they are basically attached to the auxiliaries. We don't just contract whatever word we want to contract, we consistently contract our auxiliaries. Okay, and that's partly because English needs so many auxiliaries and requires so many words to express something that a lot of languages express in one or two words. All right, so One of the things then that I would say is a good principle to remember is that unless you are trying to emphasize something, you will normally pronounce auxiliaries with less strength or focus, force, than primary verbs and other major words in a sentence. Okay, so the reason that we say I'm here is that am, the linking verb from to be, is not really that strong. I am here sounds like I'm arguing with you. No, you're not. Yes, I am. All right. With other situations, ooh, my light's turned off. This can help us distinguish between similar looking forms. So, I have 3 brothers. Have gets strong pronunciation, and that's because have is not auxiliary here. This is something I actually have, own, possess. The negative form, I don't have 3 brothers. All right, and then maybe I'm asking myself because I got drunk and forgot or something, do I have 3 brothers? All right, but something to notice here. This is the primary verb and it acts like a normal verb. Okay, in modern American English, we really don't normally say, I have not 3 brothers. And we don't normally say, have I 3 brothers? All right, I'm not saying that it's bad grammar, but it's not something very common or recommended in modern American English. And that's because this is the verb to have. If you're writing or speaking in a perfect tense, it's a different story. I've seen that movie. I haven't seen that movie. Have I seen that movie? Something I think you might notice immediately is how different our auxiliary and primary verb sound. We cannot contract this first one. I can't say in English, I have 3 brothers. We don't say that. Native speakers don't say it. And, language learners shouldn't really say it either. But in this case, it's auxiliary. It's just a helper. I've seen that movie. This should say I haven't seen. So again, auxiliary. I've not or I haven't seen that movie. All right, so hopefully we're starting to notice a pattern here that the contracted forms are those auxiliaries. Okay, we'll talk more about this in another video when we'll look at some of the more complicated forms like modal auxiliaries where we get stuff like this. All right, I'd have been here earlier if I'd known you were waiting. So even if you write this out completely, I'd have been here earlier if I'd known you were waiting. Now, it's still not really going to get equal emphasis. Languages have a certain rhythm and a certain amount of force put on different words in a sentence. And that's one of the differences between spoken English and something you would hear on Google Translate. So even if I'm reading this off a piece of paper, I'm still not normally going to say, I would have been here earlier if I had known you were waiting. It's going to sound very much like what I wrote up here. I'd have been here earlier if I'd known you were waiting. Now notice, I'd have is auxiliary. The would and have are both auxiliary. That's why it's so clipped, so short. It's like I would have been here earlier. I'd have been here earlier if I'd known. So notice I'm not going to say I would have been here earlier if I had known. That rhythm would be very confusing to a native speaker because we would be taking the focus away from the primary verbs.